there's just one more thing I want to cover before we get on to the actual list of things that you can do. And this is consciousness. David Hawkins actually spent a lot of his life mapping consciousness, which is an amazing tool now and helps us to see the differences in emotions and people's states on a scale. He put all this knowledge into a chart, which is called his map of consciousness. And this map of consciousness, it goes from 1 to 1,000 to detail the different emotions and where you are in the scale of consciousness. This scale of consciousness relates to your frequency or vibration. It's a logarithmic scale. Every level on this diagram is explained by David Hawkins in his book, Power versus Force. And what he's saying is that in the bottom half, your consciousness is quite contracted and it's forceful and more negative, whereas in the top half, it's more allowing and helping other people, understanding and reasoning. You know, it's all more of an expanding energy, an allowing energy. But I think it's important for me to state that there seems to be these two areas of human consciousness. Again, there is this polarity. You've got the 0 to 200, and then you've got the 200 up to 700,000. And the 0 to 200, these are the more kind of lower vibrations that you have to basically go through in order to get to the higher. It's almost like a school in a way that you've got to go through this process of understanding these more negative emotions. And then once you understand them, you can gain some clarity in order to move on to the next step. But they seem to be divided into two specific bands of lower and higher. It's truth versus false. It's benefit versus harmful. It's constructive versus destructive. It's positive energy versus negative energy. He calls it power in the top, power in the higher levels against force in the lower levels. So anything you do in the lower levels, you have to use force. So obviously force is against something or someone in order to get what you want, or in order to achieve what you're doing. And so what I understand is that basically everybody is in a particular area. You know, they will fit into a particular area. And all those emotions, all those vibrations, they all have their own perspectives from that space where you are. Within our lives, things still happen, so we go through the different emotions, although our particular area is mainly in one region. Somebody dies, we could still go through a period of grief, or something major may happen and we then go down into depression and fear. We still have the range of emotions, but we will ultimately come back to that area. And so it seems that the objective of man, of mankind, of humanity, is to evolve the human consciousness. And David Hawkins has provided this map of how you get there in a way, which is very interesting, very useful to see how you're doing. But it also is very useful for seeing, when you look at things in society and in our culture, where they are on the scale, so that we can then make some kind of assumptions or conclusions. Basically, if you are watching this, it's very likely that you are in this higher consciousness range. Otherwise, you wouldn't be watching. You wouldn't even be interested in this type of subject. So the interesting thing is, in David's book, before I even read it, in fact, I was flicking through it and I came across this particular page which talked about events in history. It basically looked at these events and then it applied the different consciousness to the different sides that opposed each other in these events. And this one particular event was about the British Empire during its forced occupation, if you like, of India, British colonialism. in India. But David calibrated the British Empire in India, its motivation calibrated at 175. And so if you look at 175, it's in the bottom half of the map of consciousness. And straight away you can say, right, well, that is in the negative region, the region that uses force. It uses force to get what it wants. And this will often be against other people. So it's service to self. And then he looked at Mahatma Gandhi. India basically was ruled by the British, by force. They took over, and Gandhi came up as a leader. And he basically asked the British to leave. And the British basically laughed at him. They did not take him seriously. But the interesting thing is that Mahatma Gandhi calibrated at 760 on the map of consciousness. So he is in that top area. He is in the positive region, the service to others region. And what David Hawkins said is that when you get power versus force, the power of higher consciousness versus the force of a lower consciousness, the power will always win in the end. And that, I think, is a very interesting point. And I think it has a lot of connotations and comparisons that you could then use to modern time events that have been happening around the world, such as in America earlier this year, and probably still going on. So Gandhi is a very peaceful man, and this is what denotes being in this upper area. It's about peace. It's about understanding. It's about reasoning, seeing things from all sides. It's also about truth and justice. That seems to be an inherent part that automatically will work its way to the top, like the boiling of the beans. It's a process. It's a process that you don't necessarily control. So Mahatma Gandhi, he calibrated at 760, which was very near the top of the range of this map of consciousness. And so you have an extremely large amount of power associated with that. But this power, it's not something that you can just wield like a weapon. It's kind of just innately with you. It's that powerful intelligence that will do things in the background. And I'll come on to power, which is a very interesting part of this higher consciousness. I'll come on to that in a minute. But David says that whenever these two types of consciousness meet, power versus force, that power will always win in the end. We can see if we look at the film Gandhi, and I would highly recommend looking at Gandhi because it does have a lot of comparisons with what's going on now, and the things he uses and used to defeat the British can be used today. But we can see, and we know from history, or we know from looking at that film, that it's not just a click of your fingers. There was a process. There was a battle, if you like, between wills, and ultimately, as we know, Gandhi won. But there was this bit of a dance between the two, between one person making their move and the other person then making their move, and this went on for a while until finally the British said, okay then, we're going to go. That is pretty amazing. When you think about it, that is pretty amazing. When you think of the kind of forceful power, the amount of men and the the equipment and the organization of the British Empire and the British Army, it is quite staggering. You know, if you said, well, we're going to put India against the British, you wouldn't really believe that the Indians were going to win. It's because of this spirituality. It's because of this higher consciousness that wins through in the end. That trust in this higher consciousness, in your own standing. Again, from the book Power versus Force, you've got another interesting area, and that is that most of the people in the world are in fact below 200. David says in his research of this that I believe it was in 2002 that 78% of the world at that time was in the lower consciousness. It was in the lower half, in the negative half, in the forceful half. So that only leaves 22%, which has risen, but it's only leaving 22% in the higher consciousness. But he says you might expect the world to pull itself apart in that kind of chaos and forceful action of all those negative type conscious people. But because of the 22%, just because of the 22%, they are able, with their consciousness, just by being at that consciousness, they are able to counterbalance that negativity. This power, this kind of group power of all these people in this higher consciousness is enough to counterbalance the negativity of all the other people in the world who are in that lower half, that 78%. So that is a staggering piece of information, I think, and it's very important to understand that just by being, by staying balanced in your space has an extremely positive effect on the rest of the world, it seems. When people come into your space, if you're in a higher consciousness, that will affect them in certain ways. That will, they will suddenly get ideas, they will suddenly become aware of different states of being almost on subtle levels. It all has an effect. So what I'm saying is, sometimes we think we need to all get together, we need to get on our horses, we need to do a cavalry charge, let's get something done. And let's face it, we are not taught about this. We're not taught what to do. So what I'm saying is, we are doing very well just by staying balanced. That is a big thing, and that is the number one thing I want to say later in what we can do to help the situation. And so to just push home this example even more, let me just give these points that David also gives in his book. So he says here that one individual at 700 counterbalances 70 million. Just one individual at 700, I mean, that is at the top of his scale pretty much, counterbalances 70 million individuals below 200. That is quite staggering. And similarly, it goes on down the scale for everybody above 200. So when we go down to one individual at level 600, that counterbalances 10 million individuals below the level 200. One individual at 500 counterbalances 750,000 individuals below 200. One individual at level 400 counterbalances 400,000. And one individual at 300 counterbalances 90,000. So you can see basically everybody who then gets above 200 is actually helping the planet to counterbalance any negativity. It's actually helping those souls who are still below 200. It's not exactly signposted that this is what you do. One of the problems with our society today is that all the knowledge that we need to progress is pretty much hidden for a specific reason, because it appears that people do not want us to progress. They want to keep us in that lower range below 200 because then we're easier to control and we haven't got the power. I hope make everyone who's watching this feel that you are doing so incredibly important work just by staying balanced. Because remember, we all go through the different emotions, but if we get pulled down too much by things like the news, which I would advise not to watch, then if you're in that anxious fear, what's going to happen, you're being pulled down to a lower level, and then you're not maintaining that space, your natural space, and so you won't be helping to counterbalance the negativity, if you like. And that's why I think it's very important to stay in your space, manage basically your energy. And if you feel that you're being pulled down, then it's very important to notice it and what has affected it. Is it somebody? Is it the news? Is it something in yourself, etc.? And I'll come on to all that later. Another interesting point, he says that one avatar, an avatar type person, a Jesus or Buddha, who's at 1,000, level 1,000, can counterbalance the whole world on their own. They don't need anyone else. Just one person at that level counterbalances all the negativity below 200. And that does kind of put into perspective the power that that individual has. And it also said that it takes 12 individuals at level 700 to equal the power of that one Buddha, Muhammad, Jesus type at 1,000. Very interesting. So just a little bit more on what the power means. We've got these two polarities. You've got more the force in the bottom half. It's more survival, almost animal instincts right at the bottom there. And then it rises, but it's more forceful energy. And that's often against somebody else. You know, it's this service to self, basically. And then when you get into the top half, it's this service to others. It's more love, more understanding, more reasoning. And David talks about it having this power. The higher you go, it has this great power. I just wanted to talk about this because the way we have been brought up, we perceive somebody of power as somebody who's big and strong, who seem to be at the top of the tree, and they seem to get what they want, and they have a lot of money, force their way through in a way and get things done because they're just making it so. However they can do it, then the ends justifies the means almost. We kind of got a little bit of that we've been brought up to believe in, and we look to those people when we say power. But the power that David is talking about, it seems to be something very different. If you look at Gandhi, he did not look like someone who was any threat. Yet he had this immense power, and the people all got behind him, but effectively it was that one man that, in completely peaceful way, defeated the British Empire. So we have to look at this power in a different way. So this power, as I was saying, it's not something that you can really be aware of. It's not something, all right, you've said that, I didn't like it, I'm going to use my power now like a superhero and freeze you to the wall or something. You know, it's not, it's a huge power that we have, and it gets bigger as we go up in consciousness, yet it's just there. And it seems to be, like I was saying before, it seems to be something like the intelligence of the universe. It's connected to everything. It has this intelligence that works in the background in ways that you have no idea. And you might think, oh, look, this has happened. All these kind of random things seem to start happening, and they result in things changing. I say, oh, I see that this has happened and that is really good for what I'm trying to do. But you've no idea if it's the power that you're wielding has done that, or if it's something else, just a random act, if there are random events. You know, so in the Gandhi example, part of his struggle with the British involved him being arrested and sent to jail, and he went on hunger strike. You know, this isn't a forceful action, is it? You might say he's just deciding that he's not going to eat. He's depriving himself of food, but he's not harming anyone else. He did have this strong intent, this strong will, strong understanding of what he wanted to achieve. And maybe those are the things which guide this power this power in the background that suddenly works like a magician. Things seem to happen like magic, but you cannot control it. So therefore, I think this is some kind of safety feature to this whole power thing. So somebody cannot come along and say, well, let me use this, because you've got really no control of it. It's not like clicking a button or pointing your finger. You know, in saying that, I think there are ways that the lower consciousness can use this power. Let's say you're a scientist, you're up in the higher areas, and the lower consciousness is in charge of this operation, and they want you to, let's say, build a nuclear bomb. They could even divide it up. And this is another thing that Corey Good spoke about. He spoke about compartmentalizing things and departments. So one department doesn't know what the other department's doing. It's all very insular. So let's say this guy is in a higher consciousness. He doesn't want to build a nuclear bomb. You know, they could compartmentalize it, so they just take a tiny little portion of it and say, look, we just want to work on this. How do you make this do that to do with this nuclear reaction? And the guy would have no idea that the end result is going to be a nuclear bomb. He just thinks maybe it's being used for good. He doesn't know. He just wants to get on, and he wants to sort of get into his science because that's what he's into, and he wants to work out how this works. And so he's using his power unknowingly. I think that is done. Whether this power would just use whatever your intent is and whatever you want to look at. They've obviously got the nuclear bomb to work. So it seems as if this power was part of solving the problems. So it is possible to use this from a negative angle.